In this video, we're going to be discussing Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda lived in the years 217 to the year 309, approximately. He was a second and third generation um, a Talmudic rabbi called an Amora, as we discussed in previous videos. In the previous videos, we discussed his teacher, one of his main teachers, Rav Huna, and we discussed Rav, and we discussed his colleague, Rabbi Rav Huna, in previous videos. So you could go watch those to learn more about those people. Rav Chisda was considered one of the most important rabbis, and he is the teacher of many important rabbis, as we will discuss in coming videos. So let's get into it. He was a Kohen, and he lived in a village called Kafri, which was a very nearby, not too far from the village of Sura, which had the great academy, which was which he later took over. When he was a student of Rav, the great first generation Talmudic rabbi, again called an Amora, and he would give away his priestly gifts to anyone who would tell him a teacher of his teacher Rav, who we called Rabbeinu Hagadol, our great teacher. Now, there are certain gifts that are considered holy that only a Kohen is allowed to eat, and there are certain gifts that are given to a Kohen, specifically the Zroa, the Chayim, and the Keva, the leg, the shank bone, I guess you could say, the hind leg, maybe it's the front leg, I can't remember at this time. The Zeroa, L'chaim is the jaw, and the Keva is the stomach. Those are three things that are given to the Kohen. They're not considered holy. They are gifts given to the Kohen, and therefore he's allowed to do with it as he wishes. So that was kind of his thing. He would give a special portion to anyone who would tell him over teaching of his rabbi. He also studied by another rabbi named Avimi in his youth. Later, he studied by others, and of course, by Rav Huna, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Sura. And him and his colleagues, he had many colleagues, many rabbis, and they were known as the Chasidei Bavel, or the Rabbanan Sadike, which means the pious and the righteous of Babylon. These were rabbis who were considered like ascetics, I guess you could say, for lack of a better word, because of their great piety. And basically, they would, whenever they needed rain in Babylon, they would go to approach these rabbis, Rav Chisda and his colleagues, and they would pray for rain, and they were always successful. And that's how they got this name of the righteous and the pious of Babylon. So the Rav Huna and Rav Chisda, as we mentioned, Rav Chisda was a student of Rav Huna later in his life. However, they had this kind of interesting relationship. Rav Huna once said to him, "Your name is Rav Chisda, and your words are Chazda'in, which means they find favor." And however, eventually they had a debate about a certain topic, and they had a falling out to the point where they stopped visiting each other, and later on they actually regretted it, and they each took upon themselves to fast 40 fasts for the fact that they had this dispute, this personal falling out, and at some point it seems like that Rav Chisda remained kind of alone and a little bit kind of in his own world because of this falling out. However, after Rav Huna's passing, he did become the Rosh Yeshiva and of the Yeshiva of Sura. The rabbis of Israel as we mentioned in the previous video, the rabbis of Israel generally were considered closer to the Masorah, closer to the Jewish tradition because of the less persecutions that they had and the less trials and tribulations that they had than the rabbis of Babylon. However, the rabbis of Israel and Jerusalem would always defer to him, and in the Jerusalem Talmud, he is quoted as well, and he is quoted as Rav Chizdai or Chazdai. So basically, a kind of a Hebrew version of Chizda, which is the Aramaic, as we mentioned, is the Aramaic for finding favor. His name in Hebrew was Chizdai or Chazdi. At any rate, he also grew up extremely poor, not unlike his teacher Rav Huna, and to the point where he was so poor that there's a story in the Talmud that he was once walking in a thorny field, and he would lift his garment and rather get his legs all pricked and bleeding from the thorns, because he said, "My legs will heal, my garment will not," and he did not have the funds to fix his garment. That was the extent of poverty that he lived in. Eventually, he was so poor he would eat like certain vegetables that just to stave off hunger, and basically he ends up becoming extremely wealthy from making beer. He became a beer merchant and he made a lot of money. He had an interesting family tree. He ends up marrying the granddaughter of Rav, and he had sons and he had daughters, and he said, "My daughters are more precious to me than my sons." And eventually, one of his daughters marries. In a second marriage, marries Rava, who is his student. We'll talk about in a coming video. Um, he never stopped learning to the point where when his time came to pass away, it says that the Malach Hamavos, the angel of death, could not get him because he was always studying Torah, and the angel of death couldn't approach him, and he had to create some sort of confusion or distraction in order to take Rav Chisda because his time had come. Um, the one interesting thing about him, about his mode of study, was that he would study halachas, laws, and he would learn them from the Nevi'im, from Nach, from the other books of the Bible besides the Chumash, besides the five books of Moses. And he would say, this halacha is not found in the five books of Moses; it's found in the later prophets. And he would that was something unique to him specifically, that he would learn halachas from the Tanakh. And some of the halachas that we learn from him. For example, Tfilas Haderech, that was something instituted by him. Another thing we learned from Rav Chisda was that whether or not a person should say Shechianu or Rosh Hashanah, that was because, again, it's not one of the three festivals. So why would you say Shechianu? God brought us to this time. It's the times are Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. However, once the rabbis in Israel sent a special messenger to spend Rosh Hashanah with him to watch Rav Chisda if he would make Shechianu, which he did, and that is where we learned that from. So something that we do to this day, Tfilas Haderech, the prayer for travelers, and Shechianu Rosh Hashanah. He also, besides teaching halacha, he also was prominent in the world of Haggadah, which means studying, learning the works of tradition and of the Tanakh, etc. He also would teach stories that would happen in previous generations, and one of his famous lines was that he said, once the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the sky was no longer the same. And with Hashem's help, we will see the Beis Hamikdash again with the coming of Mashiach. We'll see what Rav Chisda was referring to, that the sky was no longer the same. We thank you for watching, and this is one of the most important rabbis of the Talmud. As we mentioned, he's a teacher of many, even just as important rabbis. Very important, as we mentioned, some of the things that we learn from him. So if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe. If you have a question or a comment, please put in the comment section. If I made a mistake, if something I could have said, should have said, put in the comments. We appreciate the feedback, and we will, God willing, see you in a coming video.